I'm confident in saying that all of us involved in the project are driven by the opportunity to make a real difference for this special part of the planet.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith. I'm a rewilding enthusiast and activist from Britain, and I'm lucky enough to be sitting here with Anton Wolfaardt, who is sitting in...
I'm in a place called Stanford, about 2 hours drive from Cape Town in South Africa, Ben.
Thanks, Anton, for being with me. I'm really grateful to talk to you. Anton works with bird life, and some of you may remember a previous episode where I chatted with Penny Becker from Island Conservation, a San Francisco-based charity that I think creates a bigger bang for your buck than almost any other rewilding or conservation charity I've ever spoken with. Because Island Conservation removes invasive vertebrate species from island ecosystems. And when that happens, when you remove the rats, the goats, the mice, the foxes, the pigs, or whatever it is that's been introduced to those islands, you get an explosion of natural abundance, diversity, especially seabirds, endemic species. Invasive species have been on islands one of the greatest causes of extinctions we've ever known. So I wanted to delve a little bit deeper and actually look at one ambitious, one specific project along these lines. And so Island Conservation suggested that I speak to you, Anton, about Marion Island in South Africa. I didn't even know South Africa had offshore islands. So can we start there on the geography? Where is Marion? How many islands does South Africa have? How big is the opportunity for this kind of restoration in Southern Africa?
Well, Ben, thank you very much for the opportunity and that great introduction, because it really does set the scene for our project, which is a project that's driven by the restoration outcomes that we are pursuing. So Marion Island is a sub-Antarctic island. It's located in the Southern Ocean, in the Southern Indian Ocean, probably midway between Cape Town, at the tip of South Africa, and Antarctica. It's part of an island group called the Prince Edward Island Group, which comprises 2 islands. Prince Edward Island is the smaller of those 2, and then Marion Island, which is about 300 square kilometers, which is about 20 kilometers away from Prince Edward Island. And these are the only 2 islands, offshore islands, which South Africa own and manage. They are incredibly important, especially for seabirds, but also for other sub-Antarctic biodiversity.
How do you get to this place?
The only way that you can get there is by ship, and the island is declared as what is called a special nature reserve. So it has the highest level of protection that is possible or afforded in South African legislation. So it is not open to tourist visits. It's generally managed as a research station, and the South African government have a research vessel, an Antarctic research vessel, which visits the island once a year, and it deploys a team of researchers and support staff that undertake work to understand and monitor the ecology and biodiversity of the island and to support that work. So it's an incredible place. It is globally important for seabirds. I think most of your listeners, Ben, will be familiar with the wandering albatross, perhaps the most iconic of the pelagic seabirds. And the Prince Edward Island Group, those 2 islands, Marion and Prince Edward, collectively support half of the world's wandering albatrosses. There are a number of other albatross species on the island: grey-headed albatrosses, light-mantled sooty albatrosses and sooty albatrosses, a number of penguin species, burrowing petrels, the typical Antarctic and sub-Antarctic seal populations. So a real gem of a sub-Antarctic island. And perhaps maybe just stepping back, just to highlight the importance of these islands and others like them, is that they're located in an incredibly productive part of the ocean, the Southern Ocean. I mean, if one had to look at a map of the world, you'd see that at the southern part of the globe, it's dominated by ocean. There are very few land masses in that area. You've got Antarctica, of course, but there's very little of Antarctica which is actually free of ice and available for seabirds to breed, for example. And then around Antarctica, you've got this ring of volcanic islands, these small little specks of land within this incredibly productive ocean. So you have a situation where you've got this very productive Southern Ocean, which supports huge numbers of marine predators, such as the seabirds and the marine mammals, such as the seals and the whales. And for some of those species, such as the seabirds and the seals, they need to come ashore to breed and in some cases to molt. And because there are so few places, so few land masses for them to do that within the Southern Ocean, these land masses or these islands tend to attract huge aggregations of seabirds and seals, and so are vitally important. And historically, at least, these islands provided safe havens for these marine predators to come ashore to breed and to molt. But unfortunately, in some cases, there have been introduced predators that have come ashore on these islands and have wreaked havoc with those ecosystems, and which really is the sort of inspiration and motivation for these restoration projects to eradicate those species, to safeguard those islands, and to, I suppose, return them to their former glory.
The work that Island Conservation has taught me about really is phenomenal. I've seen some of the other projects where rats or pigs have been removed from islands, and just the recovery, not just on land, but in the surrounding sea, has just been staggering to behold. You can sort of see it from space kind of thing, the vegetation returning. In the Galapagos Islands, the giant tortoises breeding for the first time in a century and a half. And I guess it's exceptionally important, therefore, in these islands in the Southern Ocean, where you've got all these seabirds coming ashore to breed. Before we talk about the actual project itself, what about the general decline of these Southern Ocean albatrosses as a result of some of the long line fishing practices and other things? To what extent has abundance already been lost? And what's the main cause of that, aside from the invasive species on islands that we're going to talk about?
Sure, and that's a good point to make, Ben, because unfortunately, seabirds are the most threatened group of birds in the world. And that is because they face a range of threats, both on land and at sea. You mentioned bycatch of seabirds in fisheries, and this is certainly a significant threat to many populations, especially of albatrosses and petrels. These are birds that forage over extensive areas and encounter lots of different fishing vessels and activities, and are harmed often by those activities. And then on land, they face threats such as those imposed by the invasive species through predation on eggs, chicks, and even in some cases on adult birds. And then, of course, this is interfacing with climate change issues, which affect both issues on the islands themselves, but also through changing and affecting distribution of their prey, is having an impact on a number of species. And so this is the reason why seabirds as a group are so threatened. But I think the good news is that there are sterling efforts being advanced to address these threats. There are many challenging threats. Climate change, as we know, is a difficult one to solve in the short to medium term. There is a huge amount of effort that's gone into addressing bycatch, to find solutions to mitigate the threat and the risks associated with fishing practices. We know there are solutions, and I think the challenge is to make sure that those solutions are properly and extensively implemented.
So I just want to dwell for a moment on the issues that these seabirds face when they're out foraging. As I understand it, the problem are these very, very long lines that have dozens or even hundreds of hooks on them in order to attract fish. And then the albatrosses and petrels then swoop down and bite those hooks and get stuck. And that's the issue of bycatch. Do we know to what extent that, combined with the other threats, has already diminished these seabirds? Do we know what percentage the losses are? What kind of abundance used to exist?
Yeah, certainly, Ben. It varies for different species and different populations, but certainly bycatch combined with the other threats has driven many of these species and populations to much lower levels than that would have occurred historically. And so, this is the reason why you have an international treaty, the Agreement on the Conservation of Albatrosses and Petrels, to facilitate international coordination and collaboration to address the multitude of issues, because in the case of albatrosses and petrels, these are truly international animals. They are not restricted to a single jurisdiction. They're using vast areas of the ocean, and so we need to make sure that efforts are directed to improving their conservation status and reducing those threats wherever they occur. So there are many cases where the populations have declined, but then there are also some positive stories of how solutions have been found, and when properly implemented, have led to improvements in various parameters that are measured.
And I know that the British bird charity, the RSPB, has worked with BirdLife and others to implement some of those solutions among the longline fishing industry, work in Namibia and other parts of Southern Africa and also in parts of South America to change the way those fleets go out and do their fishing. So that's really working, is it?
It is working, but we need it to be implemented more extensively. So the good news is that when we trial these various approaches and when they're properly implemented, we see incredible results. We can reduce bycatch to negligible levels if these solutions are properly implemented. But as you know, often, human behavior being what it is, it's difficult to change mindsets overnight. And so there's a requirement to continue engaging with industry, with fisheries management organizations and others to improve the implementation of those measures. And I think that probably is the greatest challenge. And it's not only longline fisheries, there are trawl fisheries, there are gillnet fisheries, which kind of impact different suites of seabirds. But I think the challenge is just getting greater uptake of the solutions that we know exist and that we know are effective. But I think, unfortunately, at the moment, the situation is still dire in the context of the conservation status of many of these populations. The agreement on the conservation of albatrosses and petrels has called it a conservation crisis that needs urgent attention. So it's really a case of really needing to push to make sure that these solutions are properly and extensively implemented.
Yeah, what I find so frustrating in so many of these situations is that the technology and the solutions are there and they're viable. The little devices for scaring the birds away from the hooks, devices that keep the hooks sufficiently beneath the water that the birds can't reach them. Again, with trawling as well, the solutions exist. And these industries are hugely subsidized by governments. I mean, the global fishing industry as a whole receives about $35 billion of taxpayer support every year. So you'd have thought the least these fishing fleets could do in the way of thanks to us taxpayers for all the support we give them is to implement these kind of solutions. But thank God for groups like the RSPB and BirdLife that are working hard to get this stuff implemented. And it does seem to be happening. And then, of course, when these birds come ashore on these tiny specks of land to breed, they face a whole new category of threats, which you've mentioned, which are the invasive species. And then in the case of Marion Island, which is particularly vital, even among those islands of the Southern Ocean, which invasive species are the problem and how did they get there?
Well, the species that we're dealing with, the invasive species, is the house mouse. And we have previously had another invasive species in the form of the feral cat. And perhaps I can kind of maybe just provide an outline of those two species and the focus of our project now, because the cat issue kind of links to it. And so the mice have been on the island for about 200 years. They were introduced accidentally by early seal hunters that were visiting the island to harvest fur seals and elephant seals. So they came ashore as stowaways on those early vessels and have been on the island ever since. And we've known for a very long time, based on research that has been undertaken on Marion Island, that the mice have had a devastating impact over the last 200 years on the terrestrial ecosystem of Marion Island. What has come about relatively recently is the impact that the mice are now having on seabirds, because something shifted in the early 2000s, which I'll get back to a bit later. But South Africa annexed the island in 1948. And very soon after that, they established a weather station on the island. And the early visitors to the island who overwintered on the island found it very frustrating that the mice that had been there for over 100 years already would be kind of coming into the base and nibbling on their food and on their kind of clothing materials, etc. So they thought it would be a good idea at that point to bring a few cats to the island. It's obviously we know nowadays that isn't a good idea at all, but the mindsets were different then, and they were keen just to try and deal with these pesky mice that were causing them a lot of concern around kind of the impacts on their food supplies, etc. So, unsurprising to us now, those cats soon discovered that outside of the weather station, there were literally millions of naive seabirds that had never seen a cat before. And so very quickly, those cats became wild, started breeding. And by the 1970s, less than 30 years after they were introduced, there were an estimated 2,000 feral cats roaming around Marion Island. And they were estimated to be killing about 450,000 seabirds every single year. And so at the time, there were a few individuals who came up with an idea to attempt to eradicate cats from Marion Island. Marion Island is a large sub-Antarctic island. It's about 300 square kilometers. And at that point, nobody had even considered eradicating cats on an island anywhere near the size and topographic complexity of Marion. And I'm sure that there were many that said it just simply couldn't be done. But it took the persistence and the vision of a few people to continue their efforts to undertake the planning, the research. And over the course of 15 years, they succeeded in eradicating cats from this very large sub-Antarctic island. And it was, at the time, considered to be an incredible feat, and still is. And perhaps the people involved haven't really got the full recognition that they deserve. But they used a combination of methods, and including the introduction of a cat virus, followed by hunting and trapping. And by 1991, the island was declared free of cats, which it was an incredible feat. And very soon after that, we started seeing that some of the burrowing petrels that had been impacted by predation by cats had started showing signs of improved breeding success, which was fantastic. At that point, we hadn't yet recorded the fact that mice were impacting seabirds as well. We knew about the impacts of mice on the terrestrial ecology of the island, on the plants and on the invertebrates, but not yet on seabirds. But it soon became evident that the burrowing petrel populations that had been impacted so severely by the cats were not recovering to the extent that was anticipated. And it's now apparent that that is due to their recovery being suppressed by the impacts of mice. So looking at mice then, as I mentioned, there have been a number of studies on Marion over a long period of time which have shown the devastating impacts that they've had on the terrestrial ecosystem. They are adaptable and voracious omnivores that can eat almost anything in such quantities that they can undermine the ecological processes of the island and really drive it to a state of ecological impoverishment. So the mice have driven the invertebrate populations on the island to very, very low levels. Some of those invertebrates, such as flightless moths, are really important for nutrient cycling on the island. And so you've got a disruption of nutrient flows on the island, which has all sorts of follow-on effects. And what's happening at the same time is that the climate on Marion Island is changing. So you have a situation where the climate is becoming warmer and drier. And you can imagine on the sub-Antarctic island where historically it's incredibly cold and wet, especially in the winter months, those are not favorable conditions for mice. But with the climate becoming warmer and drier, the breeding season of mice has extended, and this has led to a significant increase in the breeding season and the densities of mice on the island. And they have moved on from invertebrates and plants. And as I said, in early 2000, about 2003, something shifted and we started seeing the first records of albatrosses being scavenged and preyed on by mice. And we think that this is because the mice have now run out of the other food that they were relying on and have switched prey to something else which is naive to the impacts of this predation.
So you're saying that the mice have learned possibly even how to kill baby and even adult albatrosses. I mean, that seems inconceivable. A mice it's a tiny little animal. How is that possible?
It is amazing, Ben. I mean, you've got a situation where you've got a small little 20-gram mouse that can kill an albatross that's over 300 times its size, 10, 11, 12 kilograms. And the reason for this is that these albatrosses and other seabirds are naive to these novel predators. They've evolved on an island that historically hasn't had these predators, and so they haven't developed any defense mechanisms against them. And because the mice are so adaptable, they have now shifted to a new form of food, which is the seabirds, the albatrosses and other seabirds, which are being increasingly impacted. And the real concern for us is that it's likely to escalate because of the continued impacts of climate change.
So how the hell, Anton, are you and your colleagues going to eradicate mice from an island so far away, so topographically difficult? These projects don't always succeed. What's the plan?
Well, the plan is to use a methodology and an approach which has been tried and tested and proven successful in the majority of situations. You're right, not every single operation has succeeded, but the majority of them have. And we're very lucky in that we have been able to learn from the experience that has been gained in previous operations. And when I first spent a year on Marion Island in 1994-95, I'd say that there was nobody that would have said it was possible to eradicate mice on an island the size of Marion Island. But a lot has changed since then. there have been huge advancements in the approaches used, in our knowledge and our experience, and importantly also in technology. And it really was the New Zealanders that pioneered approaches to eradicating introduced rodents and other pests from these islands and from increasingly large-sized islands that has paved the way for more ambitious and challenging operations to be considered and undertaken. And the overall success of these operations is incredibly high. As I say, not every single one of them succeeds, but the majority of them do. And the approach that we are taking is to use what is considered to be best practice. And for an island the size of Marion, the only approach that has succeeded is to spread a specially formulated rodenticide bait across the entire island. And on an island the size of Marion, that needs to be done using aerial application and typically the use of a fleet of helicopters. Because if we fail to bait a small section of the island by mistake, then almost certainly that operation will not succeed, because we need to make sure that every individual is able to encounter and consume a lethal dose of the bait that we would use for the operation.
Anton, why would you not use drones? Because you have heavyweight drones now doing everything from planting mangroves to mapping out distant landscapes and getting involved in agricultural production and so on. Why not take heavyweight drones? Wouldn't that be cheaper and easier than shipping helicopters all that way?
Drones are being increasingly used for these kind of operations, but there are still limits with drones. And so you refer to heavyweight drones. Given the size of Marion Island and the challenges that we would face in terms of the baiting operation, especially with respect to the weather, we need helicopters that have a large payload, ideally a payload of about 700 to 800 kilograms. And currently, the drones do not have the capacity to with that kind of payload. So certainly on smaller islands, drones are being used. On islands where perhaps the weather is not as much of a challenge, they're being used. And I'm confident that the drone technology is going to continue improving to the extent that drones will be increasingly used. My understanding from speaking to some colleagues is that the cost of drones is still relatively high. I'm sure that will come down as they're used more frequently. But it is something that we have considered. But in terms of the specific requirements for our project, especially in relation to the size of the island, the small windows of weather opportunities that we get to be able to spread as much bait as we can in those windows, those good weather windows, the optimal kind of frame or the optimal tool for us is helicopters. And so I think the way that we've approached this project is to make sure that we understand the requirements for the project, the technical and other requirements, and that we make sure that we invest in kind of incorporating those. And we also want to use tools that have been tested before rather than experiment ourselves with something which has never been done at this scale.
And how do you avoid your own kind of bycatch? How do you avoid other creatures eating that rodenticide and being harmed or killed by it?
Well, there are a number of factors that are considered, and the main issue is that, fortunately for us, almost all of the birds on the island are seabirds with a marine prey. So they head out to sea and they forage for their food at sea and not on land. The bait that we use is a grain-based pellet. And so in areas where you've got terrestrial birds that incorporate grain into their diet, this does become an issue that needs to be considered in the planning. There is a possibility that some of the scavenging and predatory birds on the island will find dead mice and will consume the dead mice, and there'll be a pathway from the dead mice for the toxin into those birds that consume that. But we know a lot about how this works on these sub-Antarctic islands, given the experience of previous operations and given our understanding of the ecology of species on the island. And so we factor that into our risk assessment and our planning. And we, for our particular project, have also we established an independent and specialist advisory panel to specifically look at this as a potential issue and a potential area of concern, to assess the risks and to identify practical measures that could be taken to reduce those risks. And that then has been incorporated into our planning. And so there are some issues around the timing of the operation, for example. The planned timing of our operation is in the winter period. There are a number of reasons for that. One of them is linked to the target species, the mice, which are most desperate for food then, and they're also not breeding, which is a better time to be targeting an eradication operation. But then the other benefit of doing it in the winter is that many of the seabirds that breed in the summertime have left the island and so aren't exposed to the disturbance. I will say, Ben, that we do expect that there will be some individual birds that we are not targeting, obviously, that will probably eat sufficient toxin through secondary pathways that will die as a result of that. But the assessment that we've done suggests that those will be very few in number and certainly not a concern at a population level. And so the principle with this kind of operation is that we assess the long-term ecological benefits versus the short-term impacts and make sure that those short-term impacts are reversible and can be justified against the long-term ecological benefits.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. Yeah, and the evidence from other projects like this shows that the resurgence in life is just astonishing once you succeed. I mean, some of those islands, the Aleutian Islands, for example, off the northwestern coast of North America, when rats were removed, the explosion of life was way beyond anything that anyone anticipated. You know, the skies darkening with seabirds within a few short years. I like the story of Rat Island, where they actually changed the name of the island back to the First Nation name, which I can't pronounce, from Rat Island because there were no more rats. So you can reasonably expect something extraordinary to happen if you succeed on this island. And I guess that's what gets you up every morning, Anton. How did you personally get into conservation in this way? How did you find your way to bird life? I'd love to know that story.
Sure. Well, actually, Marion Island played a big role in that. When I finished my undergraduate degree, I saw an advert up at the university to spend a year on Marion Island. This was in 1994. And I thought it'd be quite a nice adventure. So off I went. And I think, as with most people that get the opportunity to visit Marion Island, it had a profound influence in the rest of my life and the rest of my career. I came away from that year thinking, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And so I've continued working on seabirds and on islands. And although I hadn't been involved regularly in specific work on Marion Island, when the opportunity to be involved in this project came along, it was just I was very, very keen and feel very grateful to be involved in this project because, as you mentioned it before, Ben, it's one of those rare conservation interventions where you can actually solve once and for all a conservation threat. Once the mice have been removed, of course, one has to make sure that your biosecurity kind of programs are in place to prevent the reintroduction of mice and other species. But essentially, it's a once-off intervention that removes that threat once and for all, in contrast to many other conservation challenges which require an ongoing and persistent approach. So it's hugely gratifying and considered a great honor to be involved in this project, which has such significant opportunities for kind of a conservation legacy on a really important island, which kind of is really special to me and to everybody else in the team. And I would like to say that the project is a partnership between BirdLife South Africa and the Government Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment in South Africa, who own and are responsible for the management of the island. And I'm confident in saying that all of us involved in the project are driven by the opportunity to make a real difference for this special part of the planet.
What's the cost of the project, Anton, and how are you covering that?
The cost of the project at the moment, our estimate is it'll be roughly about $25 million US. And we are raising funds at the moment to raise the budget that we need to undertake this work. And I know that might sound like a lot of money for a single project, for a single island, but I think you alluded to it earlier, Ben, that the logistics involved in such an operation to kind of transport helicopters to a remote island, the length of time that we'll need on the island to undertake the work, all contribute towards the costs of the project. But I think another way of looking at it perhaps is to kind of look at the investment that one makes, because if one then amortizes the cost in perpetuity, because it's a once-off investment that then accrues benefits kind of forevermore, it then is seen perhaps as not such a costly project and a really good investment in a kind of a positive future for the island. And so the fundraising, we've got government are contributing funds to the project, and we are receiving funds through people that are donating out to our crowdfunding initiative. And importantly, we are also engaging with high net worth individuals to try and secure funding as an investment to this very important conservation initiative. And I'd be very grateful for all of your listeners to look at our website opportunities to help support the project, to get the word out so that we can get others interested in helping support this, what we think is an incredibly important conservation intervention.
Yeah, I agreed. And I really urge people to go to the BirdLife website, look up the Marion Project Mouse Eradication Program, and to chip in if they can afford it, spread the word. I feel confident that Anton and his team will get this done. But BirdLife has a pretty good track record. And if you do get it done, Anton, if mice are successfully eradicated from Marion, you will build up expertise, not just within BirdLife and the wider conservation community, but in South Africa itself. But South Africa only has 2 offshore islands. Will there be opportunities to take that expertise to other offshore islands elsewhere around the continent of Africa or elsewhere in the world?
Ben, what I've been so impressed by with this initiative is the extent to which the global community collaborate on each of these initiatives. And so while South Africa has only 2 offshore islands, we do have some smaller continental islands where there are invasive species that are being managed. But I think that this project will help develop expertise globally that could feed into other projects. Because as I say, there's a tight-knit community of experts, and we certainly have benefited hugely from people within New Zealand, from island conservation, for example. And there's a real sort of collaboration and working together to learn from each operation, to further advance our knowledge and our skills, to then tackle the next island. And so I'm confident that this, as is the case with other islands, will help improve our knowledge and understanding and help pave the way for other islands that also will be undertaking similar operations, because there are many of them out there.
Yeah, the team at Island Conservation told me that around 80% of islands around the world have invasive vertebrate species on them. So there's a lot of work to be done. And some countries are really getting to grips with this. New Zealand, for example, is a big leader. Ecuador's done incredible work in Galapagos. United States are doing all kinds of things in their offshore islands. But so much more to be done. And as I said at the start of the podcast, I really can't think of a greater bang for your buck in conservation than removing invasive vertebrate species like mice from important islands like Marion. So I hope and pray you and your team succeed, Anton. I feel really privileged to have spent this time with you. You're a true hero. I'm in awe of what you're doing, and I hope we can stay in touch. Thank you, Anton.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thanks for the opportunity. And really just to say again that I am the project manager, but this really is a team effort. As I say, a collaboration between BirdLife South Africa and the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, and many other collaborators who are assisting. So thank you for the opportunity to tell you about our project, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Wow, if Anton and his team can pull this off, it'll be one of the great restoration stories of our time. I'd love to visit Marion Island one day, free of mice, the skies darkening with the sight of seabirds coming into roost and to nest. If you've enjoyed that episode, please do go onto whatever platform you use for your podcasts and spread the word, leave us a review. It really helps, and I'll be hugely grateful. Next time, I'm going to be talking to Elliot Newton from Citizen Zoo in London. Elliot and his organisation are all about bringing together communities around rewilding in the place where people live, gathering groups of people to fix up rivers and streams, for reintroducing water voles and beavers, and just generally bringing people closer to nature where they live. It's a really amazing story, and one which I think has legs and spread to other cities in the UK and beyond. Join me for that conversation with Elliot next time.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about a series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.